So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thank you for joining us today on this Friday around July 4th here in the United States. We are in the virtual reading group now really into the book Essays and Understanding. It's one of the first great posthumous collections of Arendt's work put together by her literary executor, Jerome Cohn. And it's many of her, really some of her most famous essays are in this book. The first 7 or 8 essays that we've read the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks have largely been early essays from the 1930s, usually 1930 to 1933, before she left Germany. With the essay we're going to read today, which is an essay really, she calls it a revaluation of Franz Kafka, we get the first essay in the collection written after the war. So there's a 11 or 12 year hiatus between the essays that come before this one and this one going forward. That matters for a whole host of reasons. One, the war has happened, things have changed, the Holocaust has happened, and two, Arendt is in a very different situation. I mean, when she wrote those early essays that we've been reading, she was a graduate student. It's sometimes hard for us to remember something like that. She was, still studying under Karl Jaspers and was writing her Habilitation. And it's really only now that we're getting someone who's a mature thinker, who's entering her own time. And so 1944, let's just remind ourselves, the war is coming to an end. She has been in the United States now for about 4 years. She's a stateless person. She's working for a press, Schocken Press, that is publishing a lot of German Jewish literature. And one of the people that she really wants to bring to an American audience that she thinks is deeply important is Franz Kafka. At this point, he's certainly becoming well known, and more so in Europe. But Arendt is interested in bringing him and his work into the United States, and she publishes this piece in the Partisan Review as a way of in some way bringing Kafka to the attention of American literary readers to the extent he hasn't been before. It's on the occasion of his 20th anniversary of his death. I should note, as Jack did in the chat, that today is his birthday. So happy birthday, Franz Kafka. It's a good day to be reading the text on. Let's think about this. She writes this text. This is actually the second major text that she writes in which she addresses Franz Kafka. The first one, which she published as The Jew as Pariah on the Hidden Tradition, talked about a number of Jewish figures, primarily Heinrich Heine, but also Franz Kafka. And she develops in that essay a reading of the conscious pariah versus the parvenu. So the Jews, 2 different readings of the Jews. Jews as pariahs who are outsiders in society. Jews are parvenus who assimilate and in a sense become entangled in society. And then what she calls the conscious pariah, these Jews who, even though they've in some sense been accepted into society, maintain their outsider status. And in some ways, this idea of the conscious pariah becomes, for Arendt, both a particularly Jewish approach, but it becomes a model for the 20th century intellectual, the alienated intellectual who is both successful and yet understands the limits of society and consciously stands as an outsider. And Arendt embraces this idea of the conscious pariah and ties it to Jewishness. And Kafka is one of the conscious pariahs she talks about in that essay. This particular essay that we're reading, Franz Kafka, A Revalulation, doesn't concern that, and his Jewishness doesn't really come up. Just something to think about. So, what is this essay about as a revaluation? Well, first of all, let's remember she calls it a revaluation. What do we mean by that? What could she mean by that? Well, to the extent Kafka was being read, and he was starting to be read, he was largely read as a pessimist, as a sort of as someone who made visible the depressing, controlling, oppressive world of bureaucracy and law in which we modern men and women have to live. And so there's a kind of stifling depression in Kafka. And that, I think, for many people today is still maybe the primary reading of Kafka. What's fascinating about this text is that Arendt, in writing what she calls a revaluation, is actually really interested in a creative, I would say somewhat contested. I don't think it's a non-controversial reading at all of Kafka. In fact, my guess is that most Kafka scholars might disagree with her on it. But offering what might be called a political or optimistic reading of Kafka. She turns to Kafka's fictions in 1944, as Lindsay Stonebridge writes, in order to think through the imaginative terms of a new statelessness. So she's living in New York, she's a stateless refugee, and she sees in Kafka a kind of a new politics, a new way of thinking about the politics of a refugee. And that's one of the reasons I think this is such an interesting essay to read, in these days. It's in her essay, We Refugees, which we've read in this reading group for some of you, Arendt is interested in reading the refugee. Okay, there's a lot of depressing and bad parts of it and suicide and things like that. But she argues that the refugee can be the new avant-garde of a new politics. If the refugee becomes an avant-garde and articulates its needs and its voice and politicizes it, she thinks the refugee can be the voice of a new politics. And in many ways, she's doing that with Kafka. So what is Kafka's new politics? Well, rather than focusing on the darkness of Kafka, on the bureaucratic and legal oppression, Arendt pushes to the front the idea of resistance. Her protagonists, to some degree, at least some of them, resist the given system, and they refuse to accept the rules of society. Now, this doesn't particularly happen in the trial, right? So in the trial, Kay, the main character, I assume many of you have read it, but for those who haven't, is accused of some crime, we know not what. He hires an advocate who tells him, go along with it, let me get you out, but don't resist. And the chaplain in the prison says, the system is great. Don't look for some truth behind it. Embrace the necessity of the system and work within it. And Kay talks about this, the main character, Kay, talks about this as embracing a lying universal principle, as she writes on page 70. there's a way in which we lie and we embrace the necessity of lying. Um, and that the man who resists is a sinner against some sort of divine order, as is written in the novel. So here is actually a really interesting aspect of the book that I think is super relevant in our own time, especially around times of our discussions of white fragility or race and things of that sort. It's the internalization of guilt. So Kay is accused of something. It's an unbased accusation. We don't know what he's done. He doesn't know what he's done. And he comes to accept his guilt. He first starts saying, well, look, I'm a banker. I'm involved in things. No man is free from guilt. And he delves into his guilt, and he comes to feel the guilt take hold of him, and it molds him and changes him, and he adapts to the system. He experiences what Arendt calls an education sentimental. His feelings are educated, and he comes to see himself as guilty. We don't know exactly what. He doesn't know exactly what. And at the end, he submits willfully to his execution. And his last line is, or a book is, it was if he meant the shame to outlive him. What is the shame? Well, Arendt reads the shame as the shame of all of the system, namely the necessity of the system. Against this sort of victory of the system that we see in the trial, she reads the castle quite differently. Here, again, Kay does not surrender to the authorities in either the castle or the village, and he pursues a quest and seeks to resist this sort of kind of idea of necessity that he is told to accept. And so Arendt writes in the essay, Kay's story, his behavior had taught them both that human rights are worth fighting for, and that the rule of the castle is not divine law, and consequently can be attacked. So here we see Kay resisting a spreading kind of totalitarianism, and that there's a kind of hope. And then in the third book, she discusses America, which he never finished. There's a kind of hopefulness at the end where Kay joins a theater troupe and becomes, in a sense, freed. There's a controversial reading of Kafka. I'll say again, but it's Arendt's reading, and so the point is that there's a kind of new politics of resistance, and so she says that in a world in which the actions of man depend on nothing but himself and his spontaneity, you can actually resist this kind of overwhelming necessity. And then on page 80, she writes, Kafka envisioned a possible world that human beings would construct in which the actions of man depend on nothing but himself and his spontaneity, and in which human society is governed by laws prescribed by man himself rather than by mysterious forces, whether they be interpreted as emanating from above or from below. And so there's sort of a double aspect to Kafka's writing in Arendt. One is this incredible insight into the way that systematic necessity has oppressed us, and we feel a need to embrace it and accept it. And she pursues this through this idea of genius that she talks about in the essay. And she says that for Kant, genius is this innate mental disposition through which nature gives its rule to art. So great men, the geniuses, are sort of incarnations of something superhuman, a divinity or a destiny, or history for Hegel, or necessity for Nietzsche, or destiny for Napoleon. Whereas Arendt says that for herself, she disagrees with this idea of genius. Genius, Arendt says, is not to be understood as 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 according ourselves with destiny. She says, I don't agree with Kant. She says, I think genius is rather the disposition through which mankind gives the rule to art. And this is what she is taking from Kafka. She says Kafka refused to submit to any happenings. He saw the way that society had established itself as a series of necessities that we couldn't avoid. But she says, wanted to build up a world in accordance with human needs and human dignities. And it was this rebuttal of the rhetoric of necessity that makes Kafka's works, in Arendt's view, politically relevant. For all politics, from the smallest protest against the bureaucratic mechanisms in one's company to the overthrow of governments, hinges on the belief in the possibility that the world could be different from the way that it is. And this is what Arendt really sees so powerfully in Kafka. She also talks about his story on the common confusion, and I think I'll just say very briefly that the beauty of this story and Arendt's talking about it is really to think about Kafka's approach, which is that he doesn't talk about a real event. He's talking about a thought experiment. And it's to make us think. And this is an idea that she comes back to in a number of her essays in which she talks about Kafka. And in one, particularly in the introduction, the preface to her book, Between Past and Future, Arendt has a 10-line parentheses. It's one of the great parentheses in all of Arendt's writing, right? A 10-line parentheses in which she offers her account of Kafka's thinking. And I thought I'd share it with you as we end. I'm just going to share my screen and read it, but you can read along with it, so it's a little easier. And this is a long parentheses. She says, the riddle of Kafka, who in more than 35 years of growing posthumous fame has established himself as one of the foremost writers, is still unsolved. It consists primarily in a kind of breathtaking reversal of the established relationship between experience and thought. While we find it a matter of course to associate richness of concrete detail and dramatic action with the experience of a given reality, and to ascribe to mental processes abstract power as the price exacted for their order and precision, Kafka, by sheer force of intelligence and spiritual imagination, created out of a bare abstract minimum of experience a kind of thought landscape, which without losing in precision, harbors all the riches, varieties, and dramatic elements characteristic of real life. Because thinking to him was the most vital and liveliest part of reality, he developed this uncanny gift of anticipation, which even today, after almost 40 years full of unprecedented and unforeseeable events, does not cease to amaze us. The basic point that she wants to make here is that in the breakdown of metaphysics, in the breakdown of the Western tradition, first, a whole series of thinkers like the existentialists turned to action and said we need to give up thought and embrace action. But then she says after that, there was a return to thought. And even though Kafka came before this, he was one of the great thinkers who saw the possibility of thought, of thinking, to help free us. That thinking itself, not experience and not action, but thinking could have an impact in the world in such a way that it could create a new politics, a new blueprint for action that could in a sense, provide for human beings, for mankind, a kind of possible freedom, and that's what she really found extraordinary about Kafka's writing and thinking. So I'll end there with an introduction, and look forward to seeing what you guys find interesting in this essay. Again, obviously, it's an essay that it's a little harder to read if you haven't read a fair bit of Kafka. I will say that her readings of Kafka are I've said it, are controversial. We can get into that, but I think it's less important from our point of view whether she's right or wrong about Kafka, unless there's something interesting about that, than what it says about her approach. So if you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hands in the chat. Just go to participants, go to your name, click more, and you can raise your hand. You can also write in the chat, and we can go from there. I see some questions coming up, so let me Rob, why don't you unmute yourself and go for it?
Well, thanks for the introduction also. I wanted to look at the trial and get your opinion on how the character of K relates to Arendt's conception of the masked man. It seems that there is some kind of indoctrination happening, and that in the end of the book, he kind of submits. But Arendt, at least in the origins of totalitarianism, I feel like doesn't ascribe guilt to the masked man. Masked man is instead someone who is being a part of something versus feeling like masked man needs to be a part of it through his guilt.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice. I mean, I don't know that Kafka for her is writing about masked man. Now, I mean, she says who she thinks Kafka's writing about in this essay on page 72. She says the modern reader, or at least the reader of the 20s, this is about in the end of that top full paragraph. So this modern reader, fascinated by paradoxes as such and attracted by mere contrasts, was no longer willing to listen to reason. His understanding of Kafka reveals more about himself than about Kafka, reveals his fitness for the society, even if it be the fitness of an elite. And he is quite serious when it comes to Kafka's sarcasm about the lying necessity and the necessary lying is divine law. So I guess what I'd say is that Arendt sees Kafka writing, I mean, these are the readers of Kafka, but I mean, she's talking about an elite, not the mass man. I think what she's interested in here is the way that rational, elite, intellectual people confront the necessary lie of the system. And what they are exceptional at doing is rationalizing it. And saying, well, the system is there. It must have a reason. And if I am opposed to it, or if I don't fit in it, that must be some fault of mine. I must be a sinner of some sort. And so I take it to be her point that it's sort of the elite who come to see themselves as a kind of guilty, sinful exception to the system, and thus justify their reintegration into the system. The masses, I mean, the mass for Arendt is slightly different. The mass, I mean, she talks about an alliance between the elite and the masses, but they're different. The elite, the masses for Arendt are simply all of those people who don't fit in to a particular class system. They're the sort of people. They're not working class. They're not bourgeoisie. They're not whatever. They sort of don't fit in, and they're sort of the outcasts. And they're and when they acquire certain power, they enjoy it. But I don't think she sees K as a mass man. I think she sees him as, in a sense, one of the elite. If that makes sense, Rob. I mean, I think it's a question we can all ask ourselves: to what extent we all do the work of fitting ourselves into the system, which is, I think, the experience she's finding meaningful in Kafka. I don't know. Does that sound? Tell me what you think.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. I wouldn't say that K kind of fits into someone who fits outside of the class system. So that makes more sense that he would be a part of the elite.
Right. I mean, he's got his interests. He's not someone he's not a detritus of all the classes, right? I mean, he's in his class. That's not his problem. The problem is he just, he's different. His dignity is not recognized by the system of sorts. And instead of standing to that and standing up for his dignity, he, in the sense, rationalizes it. That's her complaint. Jason, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, I would.
Right.
The notion that you concluded on was the Arendt proposing a blueprint for thinking. And I'm wondering, in the context of talking about Franz Kafka, is she discussing the notion of critical storytelling in the public sphere? Is that what she's getting at with this blueprint?
Critical storytelling in the public sphere. I mean, I think that's not wrong. I think there's different kinds of stories, though. Okay. There's novels and what she says about the 19th century novel, is that the whole premise of the novel is based on a kind of embrace of necessity, and that I have to fit myself into a destiny, and that's sort of what the protagonist of the 19th century novel is. What she finds fascinating about Kafka is his ability to see that and to both tell a story that's not a typical story. There's not a whole lot of plot. There's not a whole lot of character development, but to tell a story that sheds light on that system in its horror, and then also opens up the possibility for maybe resisting that system. And so it's not, yes, I think it's a story that for her, he tells parables, stories that open possibilities for resistance. But what makes them so powerful is that they're actually not realistic stories, and they're not stories that are based in a kind of worldly reality. They're actually thought experiments, and thus they give a particular freedom from that reality, and thus a particular perch to which to criticize it from. And so she thinks, she calls, she thinks of him as a writer of parables, right? And the word parable, we don't always think of this. We think, oh, it's just a story, but it comes from the parabola, right? And she makes a fair bit of that. in other essays. But the point again is that it's a kind of freedom from the norm that she wants to highlight. I don't know if that got to your question, Jason. I'm not sure if that was exactly what your question was or not.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get to that definition of her blueprint of being able to posit she spoke about it in the essay that he was bringing forth a context, and the characters were almost window dressing to a context, and they were just exploring these rooms,
Right.
and kind of giving you that, bringing them to life, just only in that much, and the characters were only letters, as it were, literally a character.
Yeah, that's the point, that it's not based in a kind of reality. It's sort of, it's a parabolic function. And she says this on page 76 of the essay we read. She says, Kafka's stories strike us, this is the bottom paragraph, strike us as as having to do with supreme concern of his with functioning, right? The parabola, the function, with an utter neglect of appearances and his lack of interest in the description of the world as a phenomenon. And so it's a misunderstanding, she says, to class him as a surrealist, because he's not just showing the contradictory aspects of reality. He's actually invents freely in relation to function. He basically sort of starts with reality and then abstract from it in a kind of functional way. I'm talking like a mathematical function. I think that's the way you have to think about what she's saying. And creates models. And these models she calls blueprints. And she says these blueprints are products of thinking rather than of mere sense experience. And it's this thinking, which she then says is a kind of imagination, which is a kind of another nature, a separate world, which allows us to build houses and understand them. She says, at the end of this paragraph, she says, blueprints cannot be understood except by those who are willing and able to realize by their own imagination the intentions of architects and the future appearances of buildings. So, those of you who've tried to read blueprints, you can't understand them without an imagination, and you can't understand them without a kind of skill in thinking and functions and how to understand how a house will look based on a blueprint. And this is the effort of imagination that is demanded from readers of Kafka's story, she says, to not try and reduce them to reality or tie them to reality or say they're about paradoxes of reality, but to find in them the ideas. And so, so take the story she talks about, a common confusion, right? I mean, it makes no sense in many ways, but she says, and then they're based on a kind of inescapable logic gone wild. But if you really understand it, it's not about an actual meeting or not meeting of two people who never meet and the tragedy of their lost meetings and the confusion based on it. She says it's actually a model of confusion itself. It's a cognition or a thinking of confusion, presented in such a way that it will stimulate laughter, a humorous excitement that permits man to prove his essential freedom through a kind of serene superiority to his own failures. And so you have to read Kafka as a blueprint writer, not going back to reality, but of building things into the future. And that's her argument.
A schematic, really.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stefan, I have you next. Stephen, I'm sorry. You want to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. Did Arendt consciously link Kafka and Jaspers? I don't know much about Jaspers, but I believe he had a lot to say about guilt, and I wonder if there's a bridge or some commonality there that she was thinking of when she cites, I believe, Kafka in this particular piece about no man is free from guilt. Was she thinking also of Jaspers at the same time, or perhaps not?
Stephen, I don't know if she's thinking of Jaspers. I mean, she writes a fair bit about guilt in her work, and much of what she writes about guilt is certainly in conversation with Jaspers. Um, and so one of the themes in her work that she returns to over and again is the um, the injustice and the in her mind the problematic nature of collective guilt.
Mhm.
She says over and over again, we're all are guilty. No one is guilty. Um, and I think that there's without a doubt her discussion of guilt in this essay in regard to the trial um, connects to that theme, although she doesn't make it explicit in this essay. Here the idea is that you are feeling guilty for something you didn't do, and you come to accord with guilt, even though you yourself were not guilty. And that's exactly what collective guilt is. If you're a German and you're born in 1970, 30 years after World War II, and you say I'm guilty, what she says is you are, you are embracing a kind of system, a collective necessity of history that actually, doesn't apply to you. Now, she says you can be guilty if you act guilty. If you act in an anti-Semitic way, or if you deny the Holocaust, or you don't do what is needed to be do, then you're guilty. But you're not guilty for simply being a German, because you weren't part of that world. Uh, you know, um, I sort of alluded to it in my opening, and I think Sarah has written about it in the chat. There's obviously a similarity to kinds of arguments around white privilege and white guilt that are being expressed today, um, where, again, I think Arendt's attitude would be to say, anyone who says that I'm guilty because I'm white, or I have white privilege, is engaging in a kind of feeling of guilt uh, based on a historical, universal lying principle, um, and is not actually um, engaging with their own actions. And that, again, you can be guilty if you act badly on your own, but you shouldn't be guilty, and you aren't guilty simply because of a system. And that's going to be her claim. We can come back to that if people want to actually try and unpack that and make it explicit. As for Jaspers, I mean, again, a lot of her thinking about guilt, you're right, Stephen, comes from an engagement with Jaspers. I just don't know offhand if she ever talks about Jaspers and Kafka explicitly together in that regard.
Thank you.
Yep. Dina, you're next. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I was wondering what you thought the relationship was between Arendt's and Kafka's criticism of necessity, the regime of necessity, the rule of necessity, and Arendt's concept of reconciliation, coming to terms with that which is. Do you see a conflict there at all, or an inconsistency?
Well, let's say that she certainly thinks her idea of reconciliation to some important degree through Kafka. Um, you know, I'm not a Kafka scholar, so I'm a little bit hesitant to say that I see a difference between Kafka and Arendt. I can read Arendt's reading of Kafka and um, offer insights into it. What Arendt sees in some larger sense is that philosophy throughout its history was an attempt to bring thinking to bear on the world, uh, and and to make sense of the world through thinking. And with Hegel, she says, is the first time that philosophy begins to worry that um, uh, the world and thinking have parted company. And so the great project of Hegel's thought is what he calls Versöhnung, right? Reconciliation. And the reconciliation of spirit and and the world or matter. Um, and that we have to justify what is, and in doing so, bring the world back into a kind of thoughtful, spiritual meaning. Um, uh, what I think both Kafka and Arendt see, and they're probably two of the first people to see it, is the impossibility of that project of reconciliation, that the world and thought have parted company for good. This is what Arendt, this is her understanding of the end of metaphysics, as she expresses it in some of her writing. But it's basically the insight that in some sense the world has become crazy enough that it no longer can be rationalized. In fact, what Arendt wants to argue is that the Hegelian last ditch effort to rationalize the world, which often gets translated as justify the world, is unethical and is exactly what the problem is. Because insofar as we seek to justify the world, to rationalize the world, we do what Kay did in the trial, which is we accord ourselves with it, and we cease to try and imagine a truly different and better world. And so, you know, as some of you know, I've written a lot on reconciliation in Arendt's work, and for her, the question of reconciliation is always a question: should we or should we not reconcile ourselves to the world? And so reconciliation becomes for her not a philosophical question, right? Not a rational question as it is for Hegel, but a political question. In every instance, for her, the question of reconciliation is, can I reconcile to this event, to this person, to this deed? And that kind of reconciliation is a kind of acceptance. It's a kind of what she calls amor mundi, a love of the world, and says, I accept the world, even though there's problems with it, even though I don't always love it, you know, whatever. I love it because it's still a world I can get behind and I can find myself in. But there are times, she says, and deeds and acts which are irreconcilable. And at that moment, we have to signal that these things actually cannot exist in our world. And so, for example, Eichmann's actions, she says, are irreconcilable, which is why he must be erased from the earth through killing him. Whereas she says, look, Heidegger did a lot of bad things, but he's not irreconcilable, right? This is my reading of her attempts to think about what reconciliation means as a political question in different situations, which I've written about. She finds in Kafka's writing this question emerging, specifically in his parable that she talks about in the preface to Between Past and Future, and then again also in Life of the Mind. She sees the parable he as an illustration of man stuck between forces of necessity, the forces of the future, the forces of the past, and man is, in a sense, jumps out of it. And in the Hegelian sense, he's an umpire who has to rationally reconcile these two forces. In the Arendtian reading of the parable, man is a thinker who thinks the battle of these forces and the gap and their irreconcilability. And that's where she thinks we are today, in this gap between past and future, this gap where we live amidst non-reconciliation. Another phrase she uses for that idea, slightly more famous, is living without, thinking without banisters, right? To think without the banisters of reason, and to live in this gap where we don't actually know if it's good or bad, whether it's right or wrong, and have to make do. And that's what political thinking means for her today. You want to add to that, Dina?
No, thank you very much.
Okay. You're welcome. Fran, you want to unmute yourself?
Hey, thank you for taking my question. I want to understand a little bit more about the landscape of thought, and kind of like understand where it's located and how it's accessible. I take this from the quote that you shared at the end, when she says, like, Kafka developed this uncanny gift of anticipation. Where I think, like, is she placing this thought landscape into the future? And then why is it uncanny? What is the uncanny part of this? And then also, if I try to imagine the landscape of future, or this place of thinking as pure thinking without expressing it in words or writing, is that place, can I share this place with others? Is it accessible to other people, that landscape of thought?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is, on the last part, is, can I share it? Yeah, if readers exist to read it. You know, I think implicit in this is that Kafka has yet not found his readers when Arendt is writing this. They've read it wrongly. I mean, there's a kind of argument that reading Kafka is much harder than people have thought it to be, which I think is true. You know, because so many people, you know, for example, in her reading of the trial, she says on page 71, I'll come back to the between past and future, but she says, you know, the trial implies a critique of Austro-Hungarian bureaucratic regime. So the first sort of reading of the trial is about bureaucracy and about the dangers of bureaucracy. And, you know, again, I'm not widely versed in Kafka scholarship today, so I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be told. But I think at least the way she sees it in the 1920s through the 1940s is that's where most people have focused their reading of Kafka. But then she says there's a second, deeper reading of the trial, right? Where people were more frightened by the tale than the real thing. And that in this deeper reading, the real issue is that Kafka offers us sort of a uncanny, I'll come back to that, or I'll say that word. What is uncanny? Unheimlich, a kind of making us uncomfortable. We find images. I mean, you know, I don't know about you, but when I think Kafka, I don't always think words. I think images, right? You think the Archimedean point. You think the door of the law. You think the prison or the castle. The images are there, or the writing machine that writes from his essay on whatever the writing machine that writes the crimes on the punishment on your body. And it's these images, she says, which stick with us and are sort of uncanny, and that are a kind of images of the deification of divine necessity made by man. And they're deeply unsettling, but without often us knowing why. And I think they're unsettling, for a couple reasons. One, because of our awareness of the way we ourselves accept this necessity, accord ourselves, fit ourselves into it, and yet also maybe in the way that we feel guilty in doing so, some of us, and then maybe in the way we begin to think about what would it mean to live in a world in which we didn't. And that, I think, is really what Arendt is after. Is she? I mean, this is, again, I have no idea if this is Kafka. This is Arendt's reading of Kafka, but I mean, so much of Arendt's work is about this. What would it mean to act in such a way that we remake the world, that we revolutionize the world? And what she's saying is, at least in her reading, Kafka was so brilliant at making the world uncanny, making us so uncomfortable in the world. And in some of his works, he offered a path to revolution, to creating a new world. And that he did so not through rich descriptions of reality, not through the surrealist approach of showing the paradoxes or the absurdity of reality. He did so by thought experiments that really were not tied to real events, not tied to the real world, but existed, parabolic to them on a kind of off the charts of reality, took us away. And it's this incredible power of thinking. And where does his thinking leave us? Well, she says it leaves us nowhere. It leaves us, well, somewhere in this gap, in this between past and future, in this area of incredibly intense thinking, that is for her a place in which we can begin to think and develop new houses, to use the metaphor that she uses in this text, new blueprints for new houses. I may have jumped off your question a little bit, Franz, so happy to have you ask it again, push me back onto it.
I'm happy that you mentioned the word picture or images, because like when I asked my question, how do I envision or visualize the landscape of thought, I was not thinking of writing, for example, or like you kind of like immediately said like, well, you can access it by reading, right? But that's not the thinking I'm trying to understand, like the written down thoughts of someone. I'm trying to picture this thing of thinking as an activity that has no direct outcome, that exists as an activity in itself. Is that accessible to other people? I think like sometimes maybe like when you go somewhere and you meet someone and you kind of like see or feel that must be a smart person or a thoughtful person. It's more almost like an energy or something like that. And I try to understand if that is accessible to other people and how.
I think in many ways, what she's trying to say is that his parables are like that. Mm-hmm. they clearly are, in the sense that they've obviously inspired thousands, and I don't know if he's so popular that I say millions, but that he's clearly, his work speaks to people. I mean, I've said this a number of times in our group. I think of Arendt often as a parabolic thinker. I think, one of the reasons her quotations, and people like her quotations so much, and we have this quote of the week feature that's very popular, is that, like Kafka, while she's a writer, she thinks in thought trains, as Margaret Canavan once said. She thinks in images, and so much of Arendt's impact on the world are through images of hers. The table we sit around, the telescope, whatever it is. And I see a telescope, so it's there. These images are for her deeply important, and I think you're right. And this gap, this space of thinking is very much motivated by that kind of that thinking that doesn't seek to impose being on becoming, reason on the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tara, you want to unmute yourself? There's a bunch of questions I see. Tara, you still here?
I'm here, thank you. This has been a great discussion, and I loved this essay, and it really, thinking about where it lands in her production, like before Origins of Totalitarianism, this to me seems like the bridge essay, like you were saying, the first mature. And I feel like this could be taught as just like, almost like the blueprint for Arendt. And I feel like Kafka enabled her to talk about thinking. And to me, the vision of the blueprint and the house are these incredibly powerful metaphors. And then she runs through this whole riff on ruin, right? And that the house, I just felt several of it's almost like this essay is anticipatory of what will come for her, right? Her idea of progress, that it's not a given, it's not the rule of history. The way that she lays it out in that ruin, if you leave a house to its natural state, it will ruin. And that just became really powerful for me. And then finally, though, I just thought it was interesting that at the end, her reading of Kafka seemed to hinge on this idea of the man of goodwill. And I wondered what was I think we talked about this a little bit in terms of the mass man, but I felt like that was just such a kind of throwaway phrase, right? And I'm wondering what for her, even in her,
So yeah, I mean, Tara, thank you. I mean, I think we haven't really talked about this idea of the man of goodwill, and so maybe do a little bit of it. She says that in order to become part of such a world freed from all blood, this is the last paragraph, from all bloody apparitions and murderous magic, as he tentatively attempted to describe it at the end, the happy end of his third novel, America. He first had to anticipate the destruction of a misconstructed world. So this is sort of the double reading I've mentioned a couple times. There's the destruction, and then the blueprints, imaginary new house, reconstruction of a new world. Through this anticipated destruction, he carried the image, to go back to Franz's idea, of the supreme figure, of man as a model of goodwill, of man, the fabricator mundi, the world builder, who can get rid of misconstructions and reconstruct his world. And since these heroes are only models of goodwill left are only models of goodwill and left in the anonymity, the abstractness of the general, shown only in the very function goodwill may have in this world of ours, his novels seem to have a singular appeal, as though he wanted to say, this man of goodwill may be anybody and everybody, perhaps even you and me. And so, yes, I think, insofar as Kafka is an unparalleled deconstructor or destroyer of sort of the divine myth of history, of the necessary lie. He's also a brilliant generator of images of what a new, happier, magical world would be. And these often come through his parables, right, which we've talked about. And so and this also goes back to Fran's question and yours, Tara, about, well, we have these models of goodwill, and this means that these models can be inspiring to us to try and create a different kind of world. That's really what I think is the powerful political reading that she's offering here, and I think you're right. I mean, there a lot of these ideas, as I think we've talked about the last few weeks, are already present in the 1930s. I mean, it's not like a full break. And yet, I think in these early essays in the 40s, you're going to read a lot about ideas that are obviously going to reappear throughout her work. And there's no doubt that this is an important new essay in her work, a new step in her work.
I guess I just feel like through this essay, I finally grasped just that we build our world, and in building our world can trap us, because we get the illusion that the world is not built by us. Right? And that we constantly have to build and unbuild and then rebuild our world.
I think that's exactly right. And that's deeply a Arendtian idea. Yeah.
Okay.
And we should never, and the thing we can't do or shouldn't do is ever accept the world we built as a necessary world. Right. Now, on the other, let me now go the other way and say that Arendt feels that for human beings, we are both, as I've said many times, conservative and revolutionary. We're revolutionary. We can rebuild the world, but we need some stability. We need a world. And so there's something to be said for being aware of the world we're in and understanding it as not all bad, and yet not seeing it as necessary, not seeing it as inevitable. And that's what she's after here. Okay. Who is next? I think David. You want to unmute yourself, David?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I was very taken with what you were just saying. So I'll say that first and then sort of link it a bit about the images that come to mind. And to me, that speaks to that she's grasped something about Kafka's grasp of something to do with interiority, because images, in a way, are more sort of more interior things than words are. They more link up more to bodily feelings, for example. So I think there's something in me for Kafka about the way he captures something about the interiority of our lives as we live it in the world. That's not to make a split, of course, between internal and external. And with that, I was thinking of what you were talking about earlier, about and what she's talking about submission. And I particularly had in mind the penal settlement, which you mentioned before, where, I mean, it's kind of horrific, and yet one of the things that makes it horrifying is that we kind of recognize it. And it's a horrific recognition of something about what we're like. Because at the end of it, the guy who runs the machine, who's in charge of the machine, whose job is to write your crime on your body, which probably kills you, he's so in love with the machine that he gets inside himself and pulls the machine down to inflict this upon himself. And what it made me think of was Freud stressing that, or saying that in all of us, there's a kind of darkness, a kind of wish to submit. And he linked that to two things. One was the guilt, that through submission you can get rid of your guilt. But he also thought there was a funny kind of pleasure in submission. There's a kind of pull in all of us to submit. And he didn't say this, but I think part of that pleasure is the surrendering of thought. If you submit, there's a kind of pleasurable giving up, because thinking brings work and also pain. So and of course for Freud, these two also get tangled up with each other. The part that's to do with guilt and the part that's to do with pleasure. And so I think, for me, one of the things that she's grasping about Kafka, and that I see in Arendt, in my own way, is that for all of us is a struggle not to submit, not just to submit to the external world, but in order to do that, we need not to submit to a kind of siren call, if you like, within ourselves, that we have to fight against the wish to submit in order to gain our capacity to think. And that requires constant effort, and even more so when we live in a world which demands of us that we submit.
Yeah. David, I think that's really well said. I mean, in many ways, a lot of it is what I've been trying to say. So I thank you. I think this constant effort that you're talking about is what she means by the sort of constant fermata, cogitare fermata, the formation of thinking, and what she means by this gap, this living in this gap, this battle. She calls it a battlefield, right? Thinking is a battlefield. And when you say that submission is a kind of canceling guilt, and then there's a kind of pleasure that comes with it, I think that's exactly right. And I think she's arguing for a kind of living amidst the battle, and thus denying ourselves the pleasure of simply submitting. And that would be her critique of the claim of collective guilt. I'm guilty. I'm part of it, and it ends the actual effort instead of actually trying to think about what it would mean for me to build myself as a dignified, thoughtful individual in the world as it is, and that's what she calls for, and that's what she sees in Kafka as well. Is that fair? Benjamin on iPhone. Yeah.
Hi. No, I really appreciated the last answer. I think for me, there was just a gap that I was having trouble with that I think what you just said kind of spoke to it. I was wondering about the refutation of collective guilt sort of alongside of this idea that everyone is responsible for living in the gap and sort of living in the battlefield. So when she says, so to refute the idea of collective guilt, it's not that I have no guilt even though I lived in Germany and accepted the conditions and treated people badly. It's that I can't simply say, yes, we, the Germans, were guilty and be done with it. I have to personally think, what were my actions during that time? How did I act? And how did I, create sort of that space between the past and the future? There's no just surrender to the fact that, those were the conditions at the time, and I sort of did, somewhat like Eichmann tried to do, right? To just say, I was swept away by this, and therefore I have guilt, I'll feel bad, but there's no personal action. That's sort of the distinction you would say. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, and I think that is, and I think you can tie it to all sorts of other situations as well. And in the chat, I see the continuing discussion around white guilt.
Sure.
That would go the same way. Again, it's not her critique is not to say that no one who's white can be guilty. Far from it. It's to say that everyone, whether they're white or brown or or black or whatever they are, has to, if they want to think about their guilt, they have to think about it for what they've done in
Sure.
their situation, and not to say because I'm X, I'm guilty or innocent or anything like that.
Sure. And just as a quick follow-up then, so especially when I'm reading Kafka, I definitely get the sense of alienation, of the individual people participating in what ends up being very bad treatment, say, of the narrator, is certainly not personal, right? It's the system itself which is treating him badly. And so I guess she would say that there's more of a heroic call then for people, if you're living in such a system, to realize it and do something about it. Like it's more I'm just trying to work out the distinction of if it's a system which is treating people badly and one person plays a sort of insignificant role, what is the I guess that's the question, right? What is the role of that person? Are they, I guess, there to fight against it or try to make the system better itself or something like that? I'm just trying to tease out the dynamic there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think if you look at Kafka's writing, part of it is simply to make visible the lying necessity of the system, and thus the way in which the system compromises our human dignity, right? I mean, she's writing this in 1944, which is around the time she's beginning to write Origins of Totalitarianism. It's a little early, but she's going to offer a critique of human rights in Origins, and she's going to talk about the attack on human dignity that has sort of come to the surface in Western thought and Western society, and here is one of the early articulations of that attack on human dignity, and it's the demand that we conform to a kind of necessary public historical world, and thus we don't recognize our human capacity to start something new, our human freedom, and that to her is the real attack on dignity. So think about the short, I'm not going to say exact, but short distance between this and the claim in the Origins of Totalitarianism that the only truly human right is the right to speak and act in public in a way that matters. Namely, that people will actually listen to you and that you can say what you want to say and people will listen. They may disagree, they may kill you, they may punish you, they may expel you, but they'll listen to you. And that to her is the only truly human right. And I think you see an early version of that here in this essay.
Great, thanks very much.
You're welcome. Susan Oberman, you're up.
Okay.
You're on, go.
Oh, you can hear me.
Yes.
So I just wanted to reiterate what Tara said about this throwaway phrase of goodwill, and I'm noticing now all the different times that Arendt's using that term, and I don't, this was a little defined, but it's still, to me, very murky. How do you know when somebody has it? What is it? And so forth. So I just appreciated Tara bringing that up.
Yeah, I mean, let me also say, I haven't said it because, I don't know the intellectual history of this in Arendt's work, but I can't but think that Arendt here has in mind a contrast with Immanuel Kant. So, I mean, I assume some of you know the opening to the first part of his essay on law, where Kant says that the only will that can be good absolutely is a good will, right? This is the beginning of a formalistic claim of what a good will is, that it wills the good and nothing else. As soon as you say, I will ice cream, it can't be good absolutely, because if you will ice cream, but you're not going to give it to poor people, it's not good absolutely. And so every concrete will is going to be compromised and not an absolute good. Only a good will can be good absolutely. And so, what he's, in some way, we have here a claim that Kafka, in a Kantian way, offers parabolic, abstract blueprints separated from reality that offer models of goodness, of the goodwill. And they have to be anonymous because they can't be concrete, right? So these heroes are models of goodwill and left in anonymity. And the abstractness of the general, shown only in the very function of goodwill, may have in this world of ours. And so, just like for Kant, the universal law is an abstract goodwill that we can't actually articulate except through examples. And the examples inspire us to submit to the universal law and do goodwill. I think she's actually arguing that in some way Kafka's parables are sort of like a Kantian universal law that inspires us to submit not to history, but to the image of creating a better, revolutionary, good society. Again, I've never seen her make this connection between Kant and Kafka on that line in her writing, but given her obvious interest in Kant, and her being very well versed in the second critique and the categorical imperative, I have to imagine that there's some connection in her work along those regards. I just, so it's at least to put it out there. If there's people who have comments, I'm happy to take them at this point. I'm going to take a look at the chat, which I haven't been able to look at so well. If there's any questions that people have seen in the chat that they think are particularly, they want some sort of response to, let me know. So just I see a question about chronology. This work was written in 1944. It's one of her early mature works, and Eichmann was written in 1963, so 19 years later. So it's a big difference. A lot comes between this and Eichmann. There's a question from Jenny Lynn Bader. What I find especially controversial, surprising about her take is at the end, she says these anonymous, unnamed characters are significant in that they give one the sense that anyone can be a hero, but reading Kafka, one also gets the sense that heroes are few and far between, a much more pessimistic view. But maybe in this way, this connects to thinking in dark times, can anyone be a hero? Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I was just talking about this, that in a way, it becomes an abstraction. This is what I was trying to say about Kant. There's not a claim that everyone's a hero, but there is a claim that we all can act this way. And I think that is, I mean, if Arendt has one view of humanity that she holds on to, it is that, namely that we all have the capacity to be free, namely to start something new, and thus to say something original. That to her is the fundamental capacity of what it means to be human. And I think Kafka is a writer of that capacity, illustrated in such a way that it can inspire others to do so. The banality of evil seems to evolve from Kafka's concept of the devouring bureaucracy. So this is a question from Ayala. I mean, bureaucracy plays an important role in Arendt's work, and yet, and with Eichmann, her claim is not that Eichmann is simply a bureaucrat, although he was that, but more. Eichmann is the one who claims in the book, I was just a bureaucrat, just following orders. Arendt's claim in the book is actually much more involved, right? Which is to say that Eichmann, at numerous times, went beyond his orders and took initiative to carry out the final solution beyond what his orders were, and that this didn't show him to be evil in the sense of foaming at the mouth. It showed him to the sense that he was evil in the sense of banality, that he had so internalized the viewpoint of the Nazis that he couldn't think outside of it, and he saw his job not just to follow orders, but to execute the divine commandments of the Nazis, the divine necessity of Nazi rule and order, and so bureaucracy in Arendt, if you understand bureaucracy in that way, which she sometimes does, which is bureaucracy is ruled by bureaus, governance by bureaus, and in that sense, it avoids rules and laws and empowers bureaucrats to rule in the spirit of an historical divine order. That's when bureaucracy becomes truly heinously dangerous for Arendt. Because the bureaucrat then says, I'm not just a rule-bound person. I'm actually empowered to administer outside the law. And that becomes, that's the true danger of bureaucracy.
Well, can I
Yeah.
echo on that? Actually, she became a person non grata and was regarded as a hostile philosopher because she has pointed out to Eichmann basically as a social or a socio-psychological problem rather than as a villain versus a hero, rather than totally individualize and focus the blame. And the revengeful and mourning state of Israel at that time, I watched it on the radio, on television. No, then we had only radio. The time was such that this was taking away or dispensing the blame, the guilt to a whole, not only the banality of the machine itself, but the human tendency to accept, to reconcile, to even exceed their compliance or adherence to the authoritarian power of the machine. I know that she was misunderstood. I agree that she was misunderstood, but this was the interpretation at that time.
Yeah, no, that's right. Thank you very much. I think that's right. we got 5 minutes left, and I just am looking at this question from Layla Zibar, which I want to answer because it's challenging a lot of what's been said. It says, for me, this was the least fulfilling text that I read for Arendt so far. Kafka, the product of emotional abuse and feeling of rejection of what's supposed to be safe haven, is how he reflects most of his writings. He reads the world with the same eyes, the need to respond or surrender to the other's guidelines, family that for him became the world. I would say his genius comes to see how that the world shaped people, that it resemble it, and families that imitate it. Jury right and wrong. I'm not sure I totally understand. Lila, are you here? Do you want to articulate this or not? I just was interested because you didn't like this text, and it's always good to talk about someone who didn't like the text.
Hey, I'm here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's not about I didn't like the text, but I think that Arendt was trying to think the world that she's living in and the atrocities was happening in the war by reading Kafka and not actually reading what he was feeling. I think that Kafka has, in most of his writings, was trying to understand why his families were acting this way and trying to find excuses, you know, and trying to blame, let's say, the system or how the people and the society is putting rules and how families became like this small imitation of these societies. So the jury in the society and the guides of the society and the laws of the society becomes smaller and smaller on a family scale, and how this is kind of justified the abuse that he was facing in his family and the rejection on different levels and feeling that the guilt, if we want to name it, the guilt of failing the expectations of what he should be. And I think in her text, I didn't read that. Surprisingly for me, I think that Hannah was trying to somehow write to through a different understanding of the text. You know, she was trying to write about the context and the war and what's happening in her time, not what Kafka was actually trying to say. And not putting that out in the text as well, for me, that was a little bit, I don't know, it didn't feel like she read it fully. I think she was trying to guide the reader in her own way of thinking, because as I understand that, Hannah Arendt always writes the way in a process of thinking, in a process of trying to understand the world. And I think for me, she not failed exactly, but at least, you know, she kind of neglected the way that he was trying to understand his world in his own way. And this is why for me, it was missing, I would say.
So, you know, thank you. And it's always, I love it when people sort of raise the big questions about these texts. So that's great. I mean, you know, I'm not a scholar of Kafka studies. So, I mean, I've always enjoyed Kafka, but, you know, Arendt is not reading Kafka as through biography, right? And I hear you sort of giving, and I know there is a whole tradition of reading him through his letters and biography. You know, she's looking at the texts, the novels and the parables, and, you know, this is the way she reads. She thinks them through and in her own way. You know, I don't know what Kafka really is trying to say and whether he's trying to talk about his father or his family or his sexuality or, you know, or whether he's trying to talk about bureaucracy or whether he's, as Arendt said, struggling with the question of guilt in losing his humanity. I mean, I think that, you know, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. I don't believe that fully, but I certainly find her interpretation of Kafka's texts deeply meaningful and resonant with the texts, which is not to say that there aren't things and approaches she leaves out. As I said at the beginning, even absent some of the things you brought up, the biographical readings and the psychological readings, her readings of Kafka are controversial because, you know, most readers of him really read him quite pessimistically, as far at least I've come across, whereas she finds in him this kind of optimism, which I think is probably a view not shared by most Kafka scholars from the little I know about Kafka scholarship. But you know, as with so much in Arendt, you know, you have to decide whether it was worth it for you. She certainly brings an insight into Kafka, but also more so into living in the modern world through her reading of Kafka, that I think is pretty spectacular, and that's what I think, if anything, can justify that reading. But I certainly hear what you're saying, and think there's no doubt that she is offering an incredibly one-sided, strong reading of the text. But she does that throughout her life, whether she's reading Kafka or Plato. I mean, her argument that Plato is, sort of the first great, anti-political thinker, works if you have a particular reading of Plato. But there are other readings of Plato which she knows, and in some texts she even supports, in which you can read Plato very differently. And yet, so she does this throughout her life. And she's not so interested in being fair to the people she reads, so much as finding an interpretation that is meaningful and allows her to make a point she wants to make. And I think that's worth our acknowledging.
I totally agree.
Yeah, go ahead.
I totally agree. I really like how she reads him. It's not like I don't like how she interprets things, but I think sometimes reading the here and the now and not reading the, then and what happened back then, it just, there's a link that is always missing. In addition, she is also quoting Walter Benjamin, and honestly, I didn't get what she wanted to say by this quotation, by putting this quotation in this text.
Right.
Page 75.
Yeah, no, the text on Benjamin is about this idea of progress, right? That progress is supposed to be an inevitable law, superhuman law, which embraces all periods of history alike, and we get caught up in it. And she says progress in this sense is imagined best and most exactly by these quotes from Walter Benjamin. This is a point she makes in numerous essays, that this idea of Benjamin, of the angel of history blown backwards into the future, is an idea of progress following these kind of laws that she questions. So she's just offering it here as the great image of this idea of progress.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
We're pretty much out of time. Nancy, do you have a quick point or question?
You answered most of it. I just wanted to say that in terms of intention, certainly in literary criticism, that was kind of refuted for a while with new criticism, but there's a sort of way in which you can bring the author's contextual here and now back in. And Hannah Arendt seems to me in many cases less interested in doing that with the ancients, for example. She sort of picks and chooses from them, and they fit into her reception of them rather than into authorial intention. And I'm sort of getting used to that, but I mean, she could have brought in Kafka's personal history and then done her creative appropriation of Kafka, which is where she's really powerful.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Well, listen, this was great. I mean, I love how we're doing this because these are often short essays that are not her big essays. Although, I mean, as Tara said, this one was important. And yet we're finding a ton to delve into. So I really appreciate the seriousness which you guys are approaching these essays. A note of warning for next week. We're reading 2 essays next week that go together, so I think it's good, but they're long. It's going to be one of the longer series of readings that we have for next week. Foreign Affairs in the Foreign Language Press and Approaches to the German Problem. Approaches to the German Problem is sort of the more well-known essay, and so if you have to sort of organize your time, I'd say focus it there. But they're both really good essays, and just give yourself time to read, and don't get caught. But enjoy reading Hannah Arendt over 4th of July. Enjoy the holiday if it's your holiday. And thank you all, and keep enjoying reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger, and everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Cheers.
you.
Roger. Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Roger, could you send the quotation that you put up? Could you email it? The quotation about Kafka.
Oh, from the Between Past and Future?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to put it in the chat?
Yes, thank you.
I can put it in the chat right now. I'm sorry. I realized that I had a typo in it, posthumous, as I was reading it. All right, yeah. I'll put it in the chat right now, and you send it to everyone. Why is it not working? Oh, come on. Am I not allowed to copy and paste? I must be able to. It's not letting me. It's so weird. I'm trying, David. Just give me 1 second. It's just not.
Roger, may I suggest that you put it on Slack? I think everybody can access that as well.
All right, yeah, I'll do that. I'll put it on Dave. Are you on Slack? Are you on our Slack, David?
Yes, I can get that, yeah.
I'll put it on the Slack. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not.
You can also drag a file into the chat.
Yeah, but I can't. It's for some reason my chat's not working. So I'm sorry. I can't seem to post. I can't even type into it. So I don't know. It must be some glitch. So I'll put.
Long, can you verbally just quote it before we go?
Well, I can show it to you.
If you show it, we can actually photograph it with our phones.
Okay, I'll share it again. But
Thank you.
It's from pages 9 and 10 of the preface to the book Past and Future. Can you all see it or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was
Thank you
an
very much. Bye.
excellent
Thanks, Roger. Bye.
discussion.
Thank you all. See you next week. Be fun.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing this now. So is that all right? Does anyone still need it?
Yeah.
All right. See you guys next week. That was fun. Enjoy your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roger.